So today we're beginning a three-part series on the AP Art History works associated with the continent of Africa. Today we're going to be covering a broad overview of the African continent, as well as more specifically the Edo, Asante, Kuba, and Congo cultures. Alrighty, so just to give you a brief overview and recap, you'll recall at the very beginning of the year I referred to Africa, particularly the eastern and southern regions of the continent, as the cradle of humanity. Basically, all of humanity as we know it originated from ancestors that came out of this region right here. So all modern day humans are descended from these populations that either remained in the continent of Africa or migrated out of Africa. One of the things that I want to also reiterate is that we typically talk about Africa as a country. It is not a country. It is a massive continent that has thousands of individual cultures and ethnic groups. There's lots of different traditions. And just like we saw with a lot of Native American cultures, there tends to be this lumping of all of Africa into one kind of homogenized culture. So one of the things that I really want you to pay attention to as we're going through this artwork is looking at the distinctions between these cultures and how their traditions and values differ, and how that pertains to a lot of the artwork that we've been covering. I also want you to think about artwork that we've seen before, because we have covered a couple of works that were present in the African continent. We covered the ancient Egyptians, for example, and then we also had the Apollo 11 stones and the running horned woman pieces from the global prehistory curriculum. So I just want to give you a very, very, very brief history of the continent of Africa as a whole to kind of help you contextualize a couple of things that are happening at the time period that we're covering. One of the things that kind of complicates matters is the use of oral tradition to communicate information in a generational way in a lot of these regions. A lot of these cultures did not have written languages. Rather, they communicated their histories through images, which is again why art is so important, and then also through stories, just like we saw in ancient Greece, for example. So interestingly, the Greeks and the Romans and a lot of the people that were residing in the northern part of the Mediterranean were very well aware of the northern regions of Africa, naturally because they shared the Mediterranean Sea right here. So there was a somewhat famous rivalry between the Romans, particularly Hannibal, I believe, and the Carthaginian Empire, which resided in this kind of like northwestern tip of Africa. We, of course, also had a lot of influences coming in from the northern part of the Mediterranean down south. A lot of Islamic influence kind of traced along the northern coast right here. We can see the Fatimid Caliphate, Abuya dynasty. We have a lot of the caliphates that are coming out of Saudi Arabia and influencing these regions. And indeed, today, a lot of Egypt continues to be Muslim. Interestingly, too, we don't really cover them in the curriculum, but there's this region in the northeast that has been Christian for several centuries, and particularly the Kingdom of Oxum is something I really wish we covered in the curriculum, because there's these amazing complexes and churches that are kind of subterranean. They're super cool. They're called the Lalibela. So most of what we know, at least from the Western perspective, about Africa prehistorically comes from accounts that were made by the Greeks and the Romans and the other peoples that were living here, and then they wrote down what they observed. So we know a little bit about the Carthaginians, for example, because of that. And then, of course, we know of the Egyptians because the Romans actually colonized a lot of this region. So beginning around 1000 CE, as far as we know, a lot of kingdoms began to emerge further south here, coming and going with the passage of time as kingdoms and civilizations do. A lot of these longer lasting, less ephemeral civilizations established these strong cultural traditions that are deeply rooted in artistic expression. You'll recall that I mentioned that a lot of these cultures recorded their accomplishments and the accomplishments of their rulers through art in some way, shape, or form. And oftentimes those artworks were used in association with oral tradition to communicate information. There was a lot of trade and exchange that was happening within within any individual empire or community, and then also between communities, and then between the communities and then people outside of, for example, the West African imperial system. So there was a particularly famous relationship between the Edo people of Benin and the Portuguese that resulted in a lot of these really interesting cross-cultural interactions and then the exchange of materials and ideas. We'll talk about that today. We, of course, too, have these relationships that are developing later, particularly during the colonial period, where we have the transatlantic slave trade, which is this triangular trade route between the Americas, Europe, and Western Africa, where we're seeing lots of gold, ivory, and enslaved people being taken out of the West African imperial system, and then also the Congo as well. So this region over here, you'll notice that there's a lot of civilizations that are kind of layered on top of one another. This region was particularly ideal because it contains lots of gold. One of the richest men to have ever lived, Mansa Musa, was actually one of the founders of these empires down here, if I recall correctly. And his entire empire was built upon the fact that he possessed like most of the gold in the world in his time. There were a couple of other cultures, though, that did not come into contact with the West until relatively recently and are still relatively isolated. A lot of these areas, especially those that are not on the immediate coast, remained relatively isolated from outsiders due to natural barriers, things like oceans, and then, of course, we have this massive Sahara Desert here. And then during the scramble for Africa in the 19th century, there was literally this scramble of these Western powers that were coming in and trying to colonize as much land as possible because they realized how good it was for mining resources like gold and then also agriculture. So starting around the 20th century, a lot of these colonies began to achieve independence. And when you look at a contemporary map of the African continent, you'll notice that there are some similarities between the cultures and civilizations that have been outlined here, but that the borders are still somewhat artificial in nature. And especially in the northwestern portion, the territories are a little bit smaller. So the three regions that we tend to talk about when we're covering this part of the curriculum is the Western African Imperial System, Central Africa, which usually includes Cameroon and the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, and then we have South Africa right here, the Zimbabwe states. We're going to have one artwork here. It's the Great Zimbabwe City. So this is a graphic that I've included here, especially for us US viewers, to get a sense of how large this continent is. Typically, when you look at a globe or a flattened world map, Africa is made to look a lot smaller than it actually is. So to give you a sense, like here is the continental United States represented and superimposed over the landmass of the African continent to just show you how massive it is. This blue line right here is 1,800 miles on this map. So just to give you a sense of like how large this landmass is, so you can imagine the possibilities in terms of like how many different cultures and different regional and climatic like variations that you're going to be seeing. In terms of art and architecture, it's helpful to think of a couple of common trends that are going to be uniting the 14 artworks that we are seeing within the curriculum. Think of these several common threads, just like we did in the Indigenous Americas curriculum. For one thing, African art and architecture as a whole is very interdisciplinary in nature. There's lots of materials and formats, including both art objects as well as performances. Oftentimes, a lot of the artworks that we covered in this particular part of the curriculum, they have lost their meaning after the specific ritual or event has taken place. It is no longer something that is considered useful. Think of it like a cigarette lighter where all the lighter fluid is out. It's no longer useful. There's also a spiritual element to a lot of the African artwork that we're going to be covering. A lot of the artwork will address or reference the spiritual world. A lot of these communities that we are covering are animistic, so that means that they believe oftentimes in ancestral worship, or they believe in spirits that inhabit elements of nature. There's also lots of spirituality associated with royalty and royal lineages that we'll be seeing. That's a common thread. Ritual is also important. As I mentioned previously, a lot of these artworks are only really useful in the hands of the person who is essentially tasked with handling the object. Kind of like, for example, a surgical tool is only able to achieve its true purpose in the hand of a skilled surgeon. So a lot of these artworks are actually created by religious leaders and are used by specific members of the communities to carry out their specified purpose. It's not something that is just going to be on the wall and looking pretty. Most of the artwork that we cover here has some sort of purpose within the community. It was made by a member of the community very deliberately to fulfill that purpose in some way, shape, or form. There's also a historical element to a lot of this art. As I mentioned, there aren't that many written languages, at least prior to Western contact, that are represented in continental Africa. So art is oftentimes serving as some sort of record of history. This piece right here, which is called a lukasa or memory board, is actually a visual representation of relationships between people and places and time periods and so on. And each of these beads represents one of those events or time periods. And the person who creates this object knows what each of these little buttons or beads means. And they use this to communicate the stories of their community to others. When we look at African art and architecture, it's also helpful to think about representation and what it means. So art is less about a quote unquote realistic representation where you're, for example, looking at a person and then seeing their likeness, that when there's not really like a physical likeness that is overly emphasized in a lot of the artwork that we're seeing. It's more intended to be about expression. It's about using idealized features such as enlarged eyes or heads or calm facial expressions to communicate the ideal features of a person in such a way that you're creating an idealized image of a king or a queen. It's not something that is intended to like quite literally look like that person. It's a spiritual reality rather than a true to life representation. So it's not like getting a photograph or a self-portrait. So due to reliance on oral tradition, a lot of the artworks are unsigned and undated. So again, if you don't have a written language, you can't really sign your work. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these communities don't really see these pieces as a product of any one individual artist. It's usually the result of a community effort, or is even something that is seen as kind of like the result of someone that is achieving their duty in society or their job. A lot of objects are also small and portable. It makes sense that most of the things that you would be using day to day would be portable. It would be useful and utilitarian for you to make something that is small in this case. In terms of common materials that we're seeing, particularly represented in the curriculum, wood is very common. It is very plentiful. There's also metals that are used. Metals are relatively rare. They're typically reserved for images of royalty due to their rarity. We have natural textiles as well, and then ivory, which is a material that is sourced from the tusks of elephants and rhinoceroses and other animals with tusks and horns. Architecture, additionally, is usually designed to circulate air in a way that is keeping the interior of the structure relatively cool. A lot of times these buildings are constructed using mud brick, but in some areas where stone is plentiful, we'll also see stone used. In Great Zimbabwe, a lot of the structures are made of stone. The Great Mosque at Djinné is actually made of adobe mud brick. And you can see that there's some wooden foundations that are kind of providing the scaffolding of the building. So this is our first artwork in the Africa curriculum. This is a wall plaque. This particular wall plaque was from the Oba, or King's Palace, and this particular work was produced by the Edo people of Benin, which is a region of the area that is now called Nigeria. So this piece is cast brass. It was created using the lost wax process. The lost wax process is something that you should remember from the ancient Greece curriculum. It's basically the technique where you sculpt something out of wax, you cover it in clay, let the clay harden, melt out the wax, and then replace the wax with molten metal. So you create essentially a cast. So this was actually one of several hundred plaques that were produced to decorate the walls and pillars of the Benin Palace, where the Oba lives. So the plaques used to be in a defined sequence to show the lineage of the rulers and kind of the historical progression of events. Again, in the absence of an oral tradition, the preservation of these images was something that was intended to kind of solidify history and to show like who came when. But when the British came in during the late 18th or during the late 19th century and essentially started colonizing this region, they destroyed the palace and then they ripped the plaques off the walls. And you can actually see in the corners of these plaques where they were ripped from these wooden pillars, and quite violently in a lot of cases, and you can still see some of the holes where the nails were used to stick them into the wall of the palace. So there's a lot of documentation of this particular event when this happened. It was called the Punitive Expedition of 1897. Interestingly, before this, for several hundred years, the Benin people had a pretty mutually beneficial relationship with the Portuguese. So they traded lots of goods with them. They received brass as well as coral and other materials that were used usually by members of royalty. You'll notice in this image right here, this contextual image, that the Oba or king right here is wearing these strands of beads. A lot of these beads are made out of coral, which was sourced directly from Portugal or obtained through trade with the Portuguese. So in exchange, the Portuguese would receive cloth peppers and stone beads, among other things. You'll also notice that the king right here, or Oba, is riding on a horse. So horses are not an animal that naturally occur in the continent of Africa, at least not in like recent geological history. So horses were actually introduced to Western Africa through contact with the Portuguese. So that kind of made dating this particular piece a little bit easier in terms of determining precisely when it was made. So the Oba, which is the name that is given to the king of the Edo people, is depicted here. He is hierarchically the largest figure, which makes sense. He is also in the center of the composition, and he is flanked by two attendants. So there's one here and there's one here, and they're carrying these sort of paddle-shaped fans. So these fans are thought to represent kind of like shading the king from the sun because it's hot in sub-Saharan Africa, and then also protecting him. So only the Oba is allowed to be heralded in this way. And this is a tradition that has been occurring for hundreds of years. This is a relatively recent contextual image that shows the Oba or king. I believe this image is from the 80s. And then you can see one of his attendants here holding the staff with the fan or the shield on it. So these attendants are the second tallest, and then we have these two figures here, and then there's a tiny little figure who is under the feet of the Oba or king here, and it's thought that this is representing like a rival or an enemy of some sort, and he's literally stamping them down. Interestingly, when you look at the background of the plaque, we see these sort of floral designs that have 4 points. Some art historians have made comparisons to nimbuses or crosses in this imagery, so this is certainly evidence, further evidence of contact with the Portuguese. Here's a couple of other artworks that were produced by the Edo people. We have a couple of other wall plaques just to give you a sense of what they looked like. I've also included some images specifically that depict architecture because unfortunately the palace was destroyed and burned down. So a lot of the buildings have this very distinct architecture where it's like relatively low, and then they occasionally have these tall towers on them that look like this. So similarly to what we saw in a lot of ancient Mediterranean buildings, there were statues that were placed on top of the buildings that usually had some sort of significance. Also, just for fun, I wanted to include this image right here of a wall plaque that depicted a Portuguese man. We typically see lots of images from Western tradition that depict non-Western people, but we don't really see things vice versa that frequently. So I thought that I'd include that here. I just love how wimpy he looks in comparison to these other figures. That just makes me laugh. And he's also just carrying a bird in each hand because why not? Our next piece is the Sika Kofi, or the Golden Stool of the Asante people, who reside in modern-day Ghana. So this is considered a sacred object, and it is something that is said to contain the soul or the sunum of the Asante nation. It's only taken out on special occasions, and there's only a couple of people that know where it is stored because it is such an important object. In a lot of circles, the stool is actually considered more important than the king himself. You'll notice when you look at this contextual image right here that the stool is actually on its own throne. And it's also posed on the side. So typically with a stool like this, you would put your bum right here, and then this part of the stool would be interacting with the ground. So the stool is turned on its side to represent that you should not sit on the stool, and it's also placed on a throne to represent its importance. It's also covered in gold. So whenever we see an object that is covered in gold, that's usually indicating importance in some way because gold is a precious metal that does not tarnish, and it is considerably something that is of high value in a lot of cultures. So according to Asante tradition, the golden stool was supposedly brought down from the heavens by a priest. So in a lot of senses, it is literally considered like a holy object. As I mentioned previously, it's not actually supposed to be used as a stool. It's not supposed to ever touch the ground or human hands. Like, not even the king is allowed to touch it. So this particular stool and many others like it are carved from a single block of wood, usually from a ritually significant tree that grows in forests around this region. These kinds of stools are culturally significant in the Asante nation and to Asante culture. Oftentimes, stools are created and gifted to people during various life milestones. For example, one of the first gifts that a child might receive from a parent is a tiny carved stool. Sometimes stools are given to people at the occasion of puberty or during a marriage, and then oftentimes when a person dies, their body is prepared with their head resting on a stool. So stools are significant because they are believed to be vessels for souls. A part of the soul is said to reside in the stool and is kind of like something that is absorbing life energy throughout your lifetime. Interestingly, we see a similar parallel in Maori culture in what is now called New Zealand. Which I'll cover in a couple of weeks, but the sense of like an object that is accumulating a person's spirit over one's lifetime is certainly not unique to the Asante people. So there's also a couple of adornments that this stool bears. We have a series of bells that are carved in human shapes right here. These are intended to warn the king of danger in a sense, so this is kind of like an apotropaic feature of this stool. Also, fun fact, a literal war was started over this stool. It kind of originated from this diplomatic incident that started with a British representative basically saying, you guys are now kind of like under our power and you have to submit to us, and the way that we can do that and for you to kind of signal to us that you are surrendering to us is that I get to sit on the stool. And of course, you don't sit on the no-sit stool. So there was this massive incident that ensued, like several hundred people in terms of casualties. The Asante were annexed into the British Empire, but were able to keep the Stool safe and achieve de facto independence. So the fact that you would fight a war over an object like this is really indicative of how important it is to this particular community and culture. It is something that contains the soul of the Asante nation. Similar to how people revere the Kaaba in Islam, for example. It's a sacred object. So this is a Ndop, or portrait figure. So in the kind of like collected language of the Kuba people, Ndop literally means sculpture. This particular Ndop figure right here represents, and I apologize if I butchered the pronunciation, King Mishe, miShyaang, maMbul. For the test, at least in my class, you can just say Ndop and then in parentheses, portrait figure. That's fine with me. So this particular sculpture right here represents a Kuba ruler in their ideal state. Pieces like this were intended to be commemorative objects to represent the ruler and then also complement oral tradition. It was believed that like after a person died, they would want, of course, their best accomplishments and achievements passed down for future generations. And because, again, there is not really a written language in a lot of these civilizations that we're covering, one of the ways that you can communicate information is through oral tradition. And then, of course, you have objects like this that are helping to further that oral tradition or to tell those stories. So what we see here when we look at this particular statue is that it's not something that is intended to create a physical resemblance to the sitter. When you look at other Ndop portrait figures, a lot of them look relatively similar in their facial features. The faces are not something that is intended to be something that is resembling the sitter. And in fact, like the ruler would have not sat for a portrait like this. Rather, what is intended to be kind of representative of this particular person is this sort of coat of arms, if you will, that is present on this drum. So this particular king's symbol or coat of arms was a hand. So you can see the hand on the drum right here. There are also symbols that are used on the stools that the kings are sitting on to represent that particular individual. And they usually choose these designs or motifs during their lifetime to represent their legacy, essentially. So all in all, these figures would essentially secure the ruler or Niim's place in history and ensure that their names would be known to future generations. When you look at the faces of these figures, you'll notice that they're very calm and passive. There are no wrinkles in the face. The eyes are closed. This passivity and this calmness is usually intended to represent the fact that this figure is beyond mortal affairs. He is not shaken by anything. There's also this interesting proportionality that is used. The head is especially large. It takes up about a third of the body's height. Enlarged heads are oftentimes an idealized feature used in many African cultures to demonstrate a figure's intelligence. The head is seen as the seat of knowledge, which makes sense because that's where the brain is. So pieces like this were usually kept in a shrine with other works. Typically, you would imagine that a figure like this would accompany several others that are like it. Each Niim or king is shown sitting cross-legged on a stool right here, and then there is a knife that is held in one hand and then this drum that is held in the other. So sculptures like this that are made of wood need to be subjected to regular upkeep to prevent them from being eaten by termites and other insects that like to snack on wood. So oftentimes they would be rubbed with oils to keep the surface shiny and then also to keep the insects from munching on them. Another sort of identifying feature that is common on these Ndop portraits are royal regalia such as headdresses, bracelets, armbands, belts, and so on. And in this next contextual image I'm going to show you, it's basically going to demonstrate a lot of these more identifying regalia features. So this is a contextual image of the Kuba Niim or ruler called Mbwiki III. He is in his state dress right here. He's got all of his stuff. He has his royal regalia. He has this headdress. necklace, swords, he has a spear, 2 drums, a basket, and then these various textile objects surrounding him. So you can imagine that all this stuff is relatively heavy. He definitely needs some help carrying it, which makes sense. So this costuming is intended to reflect the splendor of the court as well as the individual wealth of the neem or ruler. It's also intended to represent the heaviness of the king's responsibilities, the fact that he has a lot on his shoulders. So also the value and the intricacy of the objects reflect the wealth and power of this individual. So these objects are not something that would necessarily be passed down generation to generation. Usually the king will be buried with his possessions when he dies. So these objects are meant to represent like material wealth and power, and the relationships between artists and rulers in the Kuba cultures are really interesting. Typically, the artists are not signing their work, again, because there's no written language, but they are known by name to the Kuba neem and the other members of the court, and they are specifically commissioned to create objects like this. There are artist guilds that pass down these traditions either through family or through apprenticeship. So there's this information that is being conveyed over several generations. Our final work for today is the Nkisi Konde, or power figure of the Congo people. So Nkisi is a word that translates roughly to spirit. There's one Nkisi or 2 or more miNkisi. That's the plural. So in this particular case, the spirit is either contained or released from the vessel and then can impact a community or its members in either a positive way or a negative way. So think of these as vessels for spirits to reside in. They assume lots of different shapes. Sometimes they are literally just like a bag of stuff. Other times they assume animal forms. There's a couple that are in the shape of dogs, for example, and this particular one is anthropomorphic or human-shaped. That usually connotes that it is associated with resolving human affairs. So how these kinds of images work is that they are usually created under the guidance of like an elder in the community or like an authority member, and then there is also an individual in the community called Nganga. Nga, which roughly translates to like a shaman. So this is a person that you go to in the community if you need to resolve a dispute in some way. So say you notice that your neighbor stole something, or like one of your community members killed somebody else, or like your baby is sick. So one of the ways that you would go about kind of resolving these conflicts is that you would go to Ngaga or shaman and then ask them to kind of like summon a spirit to help you out. So the spirits are said to reside in these images, and then the spiritual medium or Gaga will then kind of activate the spirit inside of the vessel to do what it's supposed to. So this spans a lot of different things. It could be healing somebody who is sick. It could be something to like seal a contract or a promise, or to punish somebody who breaks an oath. So the way that this is done is that sometimes there are vestments that are placed inside of a cavity in the Nkisi figure. Usually it's in the central cavity or the belly. Oftentimes the materials that you put inside of this cavity correlate directly to what you want to achieve. So for example, if you wanted the spirit to grow or replicate, sometimes you would put seeds inside. There's like a wide variety of different things that you can use this sort of vessel for. And then to activate the spirit within, the caster will have a nail or a peg inserted into the figure. If there is some sort of like oath or dispute between like several party members, they will oftentimes seal the insertion with saliva. So they'll lick the blade or they'll lick the nail or peg before it is inserted to kind of seal the deal. So the insertion of a peg or a nail is activating the spirit inside to carry out the divine will, essentially. Think of it as like a spirit for hire. Oftentimes, these cavities right here were covered by some sort of reflective stone or glass to represent sort of like the other side of existence, being able to see things that are potentially coming in and trying to hurt you. When you look at a lot of power figures like this, these kind of more anthropomorphic Nkisi, they oftentimes have these very upright, rigid postures. You'll notice that he has his arms on his hips right here and that he has his eyes and his mouth open. This contrasts pretty strongly with the Ndop figure that we saw, where his eyes and his mouth are closed and he has this very passive expression. He's also sitting. When you look at this figure, he's very active. His eyes and mouth are open and he's standing. So that's kind of representing the action of the spirit. So you've probably looked at this object and drawn some connections between some of the other traditions and kind of like cultural elements that you might have seen elsewhere. One of the things that a lot of students refer to when they look at this piece is voodoo. So the voodoo practices that we are familiar with, particularly in the Atlantic Caribbean, are actually originating from the kind of ancestral groups that produced objects like this. And of course, during the transatlantic slave trade, a lot of those people carried on those traditions over in the New World as well. So I want to make clear that voodoo is not about evil or devil worship. It's a very nuanced practice, and there's lots of different iterations of these sorts of practices that exist today. And a lot of them are about healing or about one's relationship with their own spirit. A lot of the media portrayals that you might be familiar with are not necessarily accurate or nuanced enough to explain all the different purposes that objects like this are supposed to have. So just keep that in mind.